The rain over the Narrows did not fall. It executed. It wasn't much of a clinic. To the naked eye, it was the hollowed-out basement beneath a defunct commercial laundromat. The air perpetually smelled of industrial bleach, masking the underlying, undeniable copper tang of old blood and the stale aroma of cheap burnt. Elias sat at a scarred metal desk in the corner, staring into a half-empty glass of amber liquid. He didn't drink it. He only watched the faint, rhythmic ripples on the surface of the cheap scotch, ripples caused by the incessant, uncontrollable tremor in his right hand. Once, those hands had been insured for $10 million. Once, they had navigated the fragile, microscopic geography of the human brain beneath the blinding, pristine halogen lights of the city's premier medical institute. Now, they were relegated to stitching up knife wounds for streetwalkers, setting broken bones for petty thieves, and extracting bullets from corner boys who couldn't risk a visit to a legally sanctioned emergency room. Disgrace was not a sudden plummet. It was a slow, agonizing slide down a razor blade. We're down to our last 4 bags of O-negative. A voice, then we'll start turning away the bleeders, Elias murmured, his voice a gravelly rasp that felt like sandpaper against his own throat. He finally lifted the glass, resting his trembling wrist against the edge of the desk to steady it, and threw the scotch. "You say that every week," Maya replied, slamming the refrigerator door shut. The appliance rattled in protest. "And every week you take them in. The local pharmacy cartel is jacking up the price on lidocaine again. If we don't start charging these vagrants actual money instead of accepting IOUs and stolen watches, we are going to be operating with—" "It's a historical aesthetic," Elias muttered, rubbing his eyes. "Very Civil War." Before Maya could launch into her entirely justified lecture on basic economics, the noise began. It was not a polite knock. It was a violent, percussive detonation against the reinforced steel door at the top of the concrete stairwell. The heavy iron knocker slammed down 3 times, each strike echoing through the basement like a mortar shell. Bang! 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 Dust drifted down from the ceiling tiles. Elias froze, the empty glass hovering inches from the desk. His eyes met Maya's. "It's 3 in the morning," Maya whispered, the clipboard instantly forgotten on the counter. She moved with practiced, terrifying speed, reaching beneath the reception desk. When she stood back up, the matte black barrel of a Mossberg pump-action shotgun was resting firmly against her hip. The universal, heart-stopping clack-clack of a shell being chambered cut through the silence. Bang! 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 "Open the goddamn door!" A voice roared from the other side of the steel. It was a voice that sounded like grinding tectonic plates. Deep, resonant, and dripping with a desperate, feral panic. "Open it, Thorne. I know you're in there." Elias stood slowly. His knees ached, a phantom protest from standing over operating tables for 2 decades. "I don't recognize the voice," he said quietly. "Then we don't open it," Maya said, her finger resting just outside the trigger guard. "We kill the lights. We wait." Crash. The door didn't just open. It was breached. The reinforced hinges shrieked in protest, tearing out of the rotting wooden frame with a sound like a dying animal. The heavy steel door slammed inward, rebounding off the concrete wall of the stairwell with a metallic thunderclap. Through the opening poured the cold, wet breath of the city, carrying the smell of ozone and exhaust. And then came the man. He was a monolith of a human being, a towering silhouette framed by the amber glow of the street lamps above. He had shoulders like a draft horse and a head shaved down to the scalp, glistening with rain. He wore a bespoke, charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than Elias's clinic was worth, but the left side of it was ruined, soaked through with a heavy, glistening black slick that Elias instantly recognized. arterial blood. It was Victor Calloway. The street called him the Anvil. He was the chief enforcer for the Tarasov Syndicate, a man whose reputation for violence was so absolute it had transcended rumor and become urban mythology. But Victor wasn't here to break bones. In his massive tree-trunk arms, he carried a body. "Move!" Victor bellowed, taking the concrete steps 2 at a time. His heavy leather shoes squeaked and slipped on the blood and rainwater pooling beneath him. "Stop right there!" Maya shouted, raising the shotgun, aiming it squarely at Victor's broad chest. "Take one more step into my clinic, Calloway, and I'll turn your lungs into mist." Victor didn't even flinch. He reached the bottom of the stairs and locked eyes with Elias, completely ignoring the barrel of the shotgun leveled at him. The enforcer's chest heaved, his face a canvas of rain, sweat, and smeary crimson. "He's dying, Doc," Victor gasped, the menace in his voice cracking to reveal raw, unadulterated terror. "You're going to fix him. Now." Elias stepped out from behind his desk, his medical instincts instantly overriding his fear. He looked at the man in Victor's arms. The patient was older, late 50s, wearing a silk shirt that clung to his skin, saturated with blood. His head rolled back lifelessly, exposing a pale, aristocratic face. Elias felt a cold stone drop in his stomach. It was Alexei Tarasov, the head of the syndicate, the most ruthless crime boss in the Eastern Seaboard, and he was bleeding to death in a basement laundromat. "Put him on the table," Elias ordered, his voice suddenly stripped of its gravel, ringing with absolute, clinical authority. "Elias, no," Maya warned, her grip tightening on the shotgun. "If Tarasov dies on your table, they'll butcher us. They'll burn this place to the ground with us inside. If he dies in my arms, I'll kill you both right now," Victor snarled, stepping forward. "Table. Now." "Lower the gun, Maya," Elias said, not taking his eyes off the bleeding boss. "That's an order. Get the crash cart. Kick the sterilizer on. I need a central line kit, large bore IVs, and every bag of O-negative you just complained about." Maya hesitated for a fraction of a second, her jaw clenched so tight the muscles leaped beneath her skin. Then, with a harsh curse, she lowered the shotgun, leaning it against the wall, and sprinted toward the supply closet. Victor laid Tarasov onto the clinic's surgical table. It was an antiquated piece of machinery, a rusted hydraulic bed that groaned violently under the man's weight. The overhead surgical lamp, a salvaged cluster of mismatched LED bulbs, flickered as Elias reached up and slammed the switch. Harsh, white light flooded the center of the room. Elias moved to the sink, aggressively pumping harsh chlorhexidine soap onto his hands. He scrubbed with a violence born of panic. As he washed, he watched Tarasov in the reflection of the smeared mirror. "What happened?" Elias demanded, turning and drying his hands on a sterile towel. He approached the table, snapping a pair of blue latex gloves over his fingers. "Ambush," Victor growled, hovering over the table like a protective gargoyle. "Rival crew, high-caliber automatic fire. I got 2 of them, but the boss caught a stray before I could get him in the armored car." "A stray?" Elias muttered, pulling a pair of heavy trauma shears from his pocket. He leaned over Tarasov, cutting the expensive, blood-soaked silk shirt down the middle and pulling it apart. The damage was catastrophic. There were 2 entry wounds, one in the lower abdomen, right upper quadrant. Bad, but not immediately lethal. The second was the nightmare, high up on the left side of the chest, just below the clavicle. It was bubbling, a sickening, frothy hiss of air and blood escaping with every shallow, agonizing gasp Tarasov took. "Tension pneumothorax," Elias said, his mind shifting into the cold, calculated overdrive that had once made him a prodigy. The background noise of the rain, the humming lights, Victor's heavy breathing. It all began to recede, fading into a dull, manageable static. The bullet collapsed his lung. Air is trapped in the pleural cavity, crushing his heart. "Fix it," Victor demanded, pulling a massive, customized 1911 pistol from his shoulder holster and racking the slide. He leveled the barrel at Elias's temple. "Fix it, or I paint this room with your brains." Elias didn't blink. He didn't look at the gun. He looked at Tarasov's neck. The jugular veins were distended, bulging against the pale skin, a classic sign of impending cardiac arrest from the pressure in the chest. "If you shoot me, he dies in 3 minutes," Elias said, his voice eerily calm. "If you don't step back and give me room, he dies in 2. Maya, 14-gauge needle now." Maya appeared at his side, tearing open a sterile blister pack. She handed him the long, menacing needle. "Second intercostal space, midclavicular line," Elias murmured to himself. He felt for the ridge of Tarasov's collarbone, sliding his fingers down to the space between the ribs. He didn't hesitate. He drove the needle deep into the chest wall. A sharp, audible hiss of escaping air rushed through the needle's hub, followed by a spray of atomized blood. Tarasov's chest instantly decompressed, and the crime boss took a sudden, violently deep breath, his eyelids fluttering. "He's breathing," Victor said, his gun arm dropping slightly, the tension in his massive frame releasing just a fraction. "I just bought him 20 minutes, Elias corrected, tossing the bloody needle into a metal tray. "But the bullet shattered his subclavian artery. He's bleeding out internally. I have to open his chest, find the bleeder, and clamp it, or he drowns in his own blood." "Can you do it?" Victor asked, his eyes darting to Elias's hands. Victor had noticed. Maya had noticed. Elias looked down. His right hand was shaking. It was a fine, violent tremor, a physical manifestation of his ruined nervous system, his alcohol dependency, and the ghosts of every patient he had ever failed. It was the tremor that had ended his career at Hopkins. It was the tremor that had cast him down into this subterranean hell. "Elias," Maya whispered, standing across the table, a scalpel held out to him. Her eyes were wide, pleading. She knew the stakes. She knew that if his hand slipped by a millimeter, Tarasov's artery would shred beyond repair, and Victor would execute them both. Elias stared at his shaking hand. He could feel the cold metal of the pistol still lingering in his periphery. He could smell the overpowering scent of the blood pooling on the rusted metal table, dripping onto the linoleum with a heavy, rhythmic pat-pat-pat. He closed his eyes. He took a breath that tasted of bleach and iron. "I am Dr. Elias Thorne," he thought, forcing the mantra through the static of his mind. "I am the architect of flesh. I am the master of the crimson puzzle." He opened his eyes. He reached out and wrapped his fingers around the stainless steel handle of the number 10 scalpel. The moment the metal made contact with his skin, a miraculous, terrible transformation occurred. It was as if a circuit had been completed. The violent shaking in his hand slowed, stuttered, and then, completely and entirely vanished. His grip was absolute. His hand was a block of solid marble. They didn't call him the midnight surgeon just because of his hours. They called his blade the devil's scalpel because it seemed to possess a dark, unnatural magic of its own. A magic that only awoke when surrounded by the underground clinic smelled of industrial bleach, burnt ozone, and the unmistakable, heavy copper stench of fresh arterial blood. Dr. Elias Thorne didn't flinch as the heavy reinforced steel door of his sanctuary was kicked open. The midnight intrusion was expected. The violent rhythm of his illicit profession demanded it. but the sheer volume of chaos that spilled into his 5 men surged into the room. They were large, frantic, and dripping wet from the relentless city rain, tracking mud and crimson across Elias's meticulously sterilized white linoleum floor. In the center of the chaotic mass, suspended between the trembling arms of 2 enforcers, was a table. "Now," Elias barked, his voice slight. They slammed the man onto the stainless steel surgical table. The patient was young, maybe early 20s, wearing a leather jacket that was slick with gore. But Elias didn't look at the clothes. His eyes locked instantly onto the catastrophic trauma of the boy's head. The right side of the patient's skull was a concave ruin. Before Elias could step forward, a massive figure eclipsed the harsh halogen surgical lights. The crime boss was a mountain of muscle and tailored Italian wool, though the suit was currently ruined, soaked black with the blood of the boy on the table. Victor's face was a mask of desperate fear. He moved with the unpredictable kinetic energy of a cornered predator, pulling a nickel-plated .45 caliber pistol. "You fix him, Doc." Elias didn't blink. He didn't raise his hands. He simply "Put the gun away, Victor," Elias said, his tone as flat and cold as the stainless steel table. "Guns don't hold back intracranial pressure. And if you discharge that weapon in my theater, you'll compromise my sterile field. Which means your brother dies of sepsis if the brain herniation doesn't kill him first." "Don't give me your medical bullshit," Victor screamed. Elias felt the cold ring of the barrel, felt the heat radiating from Victor's massive, trembling frame. He could smell the stale cigar smoke, the sweat, the sheer terror rolling off the crime boss. "I am trying to," Elias whispered, never breaking eye contact. "But you are standing on my oxygen line." Victor blinked, glancing down. Before Victor could react, a shadow detached itself from the far corner of the room. Maya Lin moved with a fluid, terrifying grace. She didn't run. She flowed. Dressed in dark, she didn't draw a weapon, though Elias knew she had a suppressed Glock 19 resting against the small of her back and a karambit blade hidden in her thigh. Maya's hand shot out not toward Victor, but toward the largest thug standing closest to the surgical tray. She drove the heel of her palm into his sternum with a sharp, concussive crack, sending the 250-pound man stumbling backward into the brick wall. "Back the fuck up," Maya said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a sub-zero frequency that demanded instant obedience. She pointed a slender, gloved finger at the yellow line painted on the floor, the demarcation of the sterile zone. "Everyone behind the yellow line. Now." Another thug raised an Uzi, his hands shaking. "You don't give the orders here." Maya shifted her weight, her hand. "If you don't step behind that line in 3 seconds, I will trigger the hit." "Do what she says," Victor barked, lowering his gun from Elias's head, though he kept it gripped tightly at his side. He glared at his men. The thugs scrambled backward. Maya didn't waste a second. She hit a heavy. She twisted the deadbolt, locking Victor and Elias inside the surgical suite with the patient. While Victor's men were trapped in the observation, Maya stepped over to the bank of security monitors, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "Exterior cameras show no pursuit," she reported, her voice returning to its crisp, professional cadence. "Alley is clear. Thermal imaging shows nothing in a 2-block radius. The perimeter is secure, Doctor. You have the floor." "Thank you, Maya," Elias said, already turning his back on Victor. The threat of the gun had evaporated from his mind the second it was removed from his forehead. He had a singular focus now, the puzzle of the broken human body. Elias stepped to the table, snapping on a pair of nitrile examination gloves. He leaned over the boy. The breathing was agonal. Ragged, shallow gasps that indicated the brainstem was already suffocating under immense pressure. Elias gently placed his hands on the boy's scalp. The tactile feedback was horrifying. Beneath the matted, blood-soaked hair, the right parietal bone felt like a bag of crushed ice. It was a severe depressed skull fracture, a blunt force trauma of monumental proportions. "What hit him?" Elias asked, pulling a penlight from his pocket. "Crowbar," Victor rasped, his voice suddenly hollow, the rage draining out of him. "He's dying," Elias said clinically, shining the harsh beam of light into the boy's left eye. The pupil constricted. He moved to the right eye. The pupil was blown wide, fixed, and unresponsive. The black void of a dying brain. Cushing's triad. His blood pressure is skyrocketing, his pulse is plummeting, and his breathing is failing. So fix it," Victor pleaded. "I need to decompress the skull, evacuate the clot, and ligate the artery," Elias said, his mind already mapping the surgical approach. He looked up at Maya. "Push 100 grams of mannitol and a bolus of hypertonic saline. We need to shrink the brain tissue, buy us some time. Intubate him and set the ventilator to hyperventilate. Blow off the CO2 to constrict the cerebral vessels." "On it," Maya said, moving to the crash cart with practiced efficiency. She drew up the clear liquids into large syringes, injecting them directly into the boy's foreline before grabbing the laryngoscope to secure his airway. Elias stepped away from the table, moving toward the deep stainless steel sink in the corner of the room. It was time. The ritual. He pressed his knee against the lever beneath the sink, and hot water cascaded from the automated faucet. He grabbed a sponge loaded with chlorhexidine gluconate and began despite the frantic beeping of the heart monitor, despite the dying boy on the table, despite the ruthless crime boss standing 10 feet away holding a loaded weapon, Elias found his zen. The sound of the running water was a white noise that washed away the grit and grime of the underground world. He scrubbed his fingernails, the harsh bristles digging into his skin. He moved to his fingers, scrubbing each side, then the palms, the backs of his hands, moving methodically down his forearms to the elbows. It was a meditative trance. With every stroke of the sponge, Elias Thorne, the disgraced, underground butcher, faded away. "Doc, his heart rate is dropping," Victor panicked, stepping toward the table. "Step back, Victor," Maya warned softly, securing the endotracheal tube and taping it to the boy's face. "The medication takes a minute to work. You are in the way." Elias rinsed his arms, keeping his hands elevated above his elbows, letting the contaminated water drip away. He didn't reach for a towel. Maya was there, unfolding a sterile blue surgical towel, handing it to him without breaking eye contact with the monitors. Elias dried his hands, then slid his arms into the sterile blue surgical gown Maya held open for him. She tied it tight at his back. He thrust his hands into the size 7.5 sterile latex gloves, the sharp snap of the rubber echoing in the tense silence of the room. He was scrubbed in. Elias turned back to the surgical table. The boy's head had been shaved by Maya in the 3 minutes it took Elias to scrub, the pale skin painted with the dark, iodine-orange stain of betadine. The ruined landscape of the skull was laid bare under the blinding theater lights. Elias held out his right hand, palm up. He didn't need to speak. Maya slapped a number 10 scalpel into his palm. The weight of the steel was comforting. It was the only truth Elias believed in anymore. Out there, in the neon-drenched streets of the city, men lied, betrayed, and murdered. But flesh and bone never lied. "Time of first incision, 2:14 a.m., Elias murmured, his voice. He pressed Maya, suction, and bipolar cautery, Elias ordered, his vision tunneling down to the microscopic level. "Victor, if you pray, start now." Because I am going to have to take your brother's. Elias grabbed the periosteal elevator, peeling back the scalp to expose the gruesome, jagged mosaic of the shattered skull beneath. The devil's work had been done by the crowbar. Now it was time for the surgeon's scalpel to attempt a miracle. The operating room was a sanctuary built in hell. Buried 3 stories beneath the crumbling asphalt of the meatpacking district, the subterranean clinic was an architectural anomaly, a patchwork of rusted industrial girders and state-of-the-art sterile environments. The walls, lined with heavy sheets of marine-grade stainless steel, reflected the harsh, blinding glare of the surgical halogens. The air was thick with the warring scents of chlorhexidine, iodine, and the faint, underlying metallic tang of old blood that never truly washed out of the concrete floor. The rhythmic, mechanical sigh of the ventilator was the only sound permitted in the room, setting a metronomic tempo for the violence about to unfold. Dr. Elias Thorne stood at the head of the operating table. His gloved hand beneath the blue surgical drapes lay Victor, the Anvil Calloway. "Vitals?" Elias asked, his voice muffled behind the heavy synthetic mesh of his surgical mask. It was a low, even baritone, deliberately devoid of the adrenaline that thrummed through his veins. Across the table, Maya Lin adjusted a dial on the anesthesia machine. Only her dark, almond-shaped eyes were visible above her mask, calm and impossibly sharp. She was the anchor to Elias's storm, a trauma nurse who had seen the worst of humanity and learned to measure it in blood pressure over heart rate. "Heart rate is 62 and steady," Maya reported, her eyes flicking to the glowing green waveform on the monitor. "Blood pressure 110/70. He's deep, Elias. ICP is stable for now, but the swelling around the entry wound is profound. You have a window, but it's closing." Elias nodded once. He closed his eyes, centering himself. Beyond the thick steel door of the OR, he knew Calloway's heavily armed lieutenants were pacing the corridor like caged wolves. If Victor died on this table, Elias and Maya would not leave this basement alive. The stakes were all right, Elias murmured, opening his eyes. The world narrowed down to the 6-inch square of exposed scalp on the right temporal lobe. "Let's open the vault." "Scalpel." Maya slapped the heavy steel handle of a number 10 scalpel into his waiting palm. The tactile feedback of the instrument grounding in his grip sent. Elias brought the curved belly of the blade down to the painted skin. He pressed, applying exact, measured force, and drew the blade in a smooth, sweeping question mark curve starting from the front of the ear and arching toward the crown. The skin parted instantly, a bloodless white line for a fraction of a second before the highly vascular scalp rebelled. Crimson welled up, thick and dark, spilling down the curve of "Suction and bipolar," Elias commanded. Maya was already there, the plastic Yankauer suction tip slurping away the pooling blood while Elias took the tweezers of the bipolar electrocautery. He pinched the bleeding vessels, stepping on the foot pedal. A sharp electrical buzz broke the silence, accompanied by the acrid, stomach-churning stench of burning flesh and a thin wisp of gray smoke that curled into the glare of the overhead lights. Methodically, Elias worked his way down to the bone. He used rainy clips to clamp the edges of the scalp, rolling the thick flap of skin and muscle back and securing it with fishhook retractors. The skull was exposed, a pale, yellowish-white dome, marred by the jagged, pulverized crater where a .45 caliber bullet had shattered the bone and driven fragments deep into the cranial vault. "Drill," Elias said. Maya handed him the pneumatic perforator. It was heavy, tethered to a coiled air hose. Elias positioned the bit just outside the fracture lines. He squeezed the trigger. The drill screamed to life, a high-pitched, tooth-rattling whine that vibrated up through Elias's wrists and into his jaw. He leaned into it, feeling the resistance of the dense outer table of the skull, then the slight give of the softer marrow-like diploe, and finally the sudden drop in pressure as the bit breached the inner table. The drill's clutch automatically disengaged before it could plunge into the brain. He drilled 3 more burr holes, the air filling with the distinct, chalky odor of aerosolized bone dust. Beneath the bone lay the dura mater, the leathery, silver-blue membrane that encased the brain. It was tense, bulging outward under the sheer pressure of the trauma beneath it. It looked angry, discolored by a massive subdural hematoma. "Dura is tight," Elias muttered, his brow furrowing. A single bead of sweat formed at his temple. Heart rate creeping up. 75. BP spiking. 140/90, Maya said, her tone tightening just a fraction. "He's reacting to the intracranial pressure. You need to relieve it, Elias." "Knife. Number 11. Elias took the fine-tipped blade. He needed to make a microscopic nick in the dura, just enough to slip the surgical scissors in without slicing the fragile cerebral cortex beneath. He held his breath, his hand steadying into absolute, statuesque stillness. The blade hovered a millimeter above the bulging membrane. Then the lights died. It wasn't a flicker. It was a violent, instantaneous severing of the electrical current. The blinding halogens vanished, replaced by an abyss of absolute, suffocating darkness. The rhythmic sigh of the ventilator cut off with a dying wheeze. The low hum of the HEPA filters spun down into agonizing silence. For 1 second, the only light in the room came from the faint, sickly green glow of the anesthesia monitors, running off their internal batteries. "Maya," Elias said, his voice a sharp whip crack in the dark. He didn't move an inch. His scalpel was still hovering directly over Calloway's exposed brain. If he flinched, if he bumped the table in the pitch black, he would instantly lobotomize the man. Power grid failure. The main generator didn't kick over. Maya's voice came from the darkness, fast and purely pragmatic. "I'm moving. Don't breathe." Outside the heavy steel doors, muffled shouts erupted. Heavy fists began pounding on the reinforced steel. The mobsters had realized the power was out. "Doctor!" A muffled, gravelly voice roared from the corridor. "What the hell is going on in there? Open the door." "Ignore them," Elias said to the dark. "Get the lights." "He's not breathing on his own. Bagging him now," Maya said. In the gloom, Elias saw her silhouette move swiftly to the head of the table. She detached the dead mechanical ventilator and attached a manual resuscitator bag to Calloway's endotracheal tube. She began squeezing it rhythmically. Whoosh. Pause. Whoosh. "Headlamps in the top drawer of the crash cart," Elias said. "Hurry." Maya reached over, blindly navigating the room she knew by heart. A drawer slammed. A moment later, a blinding beam of LED white light cut through the darkness, strapped to Maya's forehead. She grabbed a second one and quickly secured it around Elias's head, snapping the light on. The dual beams converged on the surgical field. It was a disaster. Without the overhead halogens, the light was harsh, flat, and cast deep, confusing shadows into the crater of Calloway's skull. Depth perception, the surgeon's most vital tool, was instantly compromised. "The electric suction is dead," Maya said, her hands never stopping their rhythmic squeezing of the oxygen bag. "Bipolar cautery is dead. The drill is dead." Elias stared down into the wound. The dura was still bulging. He couldn't stop. If he waited for the power to return, the brain would herniate through the base of the skull, crushing the brainstem. Calloway would be dead in minutes. "We go analog," Elias said, his voice dropping into a freezing, terrifying calm. "Get the bulb syringe for suction. Hand me the microscissors. We do this by hand." Maya tossed a large, rubber bulb syringe onto the sterile drape. I have to keep bag. Elias took the number 11 blade in his right hand. He adjusted his stance, leaning closer so his headlamp illuminated the exact center of the bruised dura. He made the incision a tiny, perfect puncture. Dark, deoxygenated blood immediately welled up, thick as motor oil. Elias dropped the blade, snatched the bulb syringe with his left hand, squeezed it, and plunged the plastic tip into the blood. He released the bulb, sucking the field clear, then squirted the blood onto a surgical towel. He grabbed the micro-scissors with his right hand, slipped the lower blade beneath the dura, and snipped. Snip, suction, squeeze, snip, suction, squeeze. It was an agonizing, primitive dance. Neurosurgery was meant to be a symphony of ultrasonic aspirators and microscopic lasers. Elias was using the equivalent of a hand-cranked pump and tailoring shears. His forearms burned with the awkward tension of performing two contradictory motions at once. He peeled back the dural flaps, pinning them with wet cottonoids. The brain lay exposed in the harsh LED light. It was swollen, angry red, and violently bruised. And there, buried deep within the sulci of the temporal lobe, glinted the jagged, twisted chunk of lead and copper jacket. The bullet fragment. It was resting directly against the middle cerebral artery. A vessel as thick as a drinking straw, pulsing furiously with every manual breath Maya forced into Calloway's lungs. "I see it," Elias whispered. The pounding on the steel door outside was growing louder. They were using something heavy now. A fire extinguisher, maybe. The steel vibrated with every strike. "Elias, his pressure is dropping. The hematoma is relieved, but he's bleeding from the cortical vessels." Elias traded the scissors for a pair of delicate, titanium microforceps. They were completely unpowered. If the artery tore, he had no electrical current to instantly burn it shut. He would have to tie off a microscopic vessel deep inside a bleeding brain by hand, an impossible feat in the dark. He lowered the forceps into the wound. The shadow of his own hand blocked the light from his headlamp, plunging the bullet into darkness. Elias cursed under his breath. "Maya, I need your light. Lean in." Maya leaned forward over the table, her hands still rhythmically pumping the bag. Her headlamp cut beneath Elias's hand, illuminating the twisted metal fragment. Elias breathed out, emptying his lungs. He held the emptiness. His hand became a statue. He slid the tips of the forceps down, past the pulsing, fragile wall of the artery. He could see the vessel expanding and contracting, brushing against the cold titanium of his instrument. 1 millimeter of tremor and the artery would rupture. Outside, a massive clang echoed through the metal was slick with blood and brain matter. It threatened to slip. He applied perfectly calibrated pressure, enough to hold the lead, not enough to crush it into smaller, deadlier fragments. Slowly, agonizingly, Elias pulled upward. The fragment resisted, caught in a web of arachnoid tissue. Elias gave it a microscopic twist, freeing it from the tissue without nicking the artery. The fragment pulled clear of the brain. Elias withdrew his hand, bringing the bloody chunk of metal out of the skull. He dropped it into the stainless steel kidney basin. It landed with a sharp, heavy clink that somehow echoed louder than the pounding on the door. Elias grabbed a square of Surgical, a dissolving hemostatic mesh, and packed it gently against the bleeding cortical vessels. With a gloved finger, he held pressure in the dark, his breath ragged behind his mask, waiting to see if the primitive patch would hold the blood at bay. The human body holds approximately 5 liters of blood. Victor, the Anvil Calloway, an absolute leviathan of a man, likely held closer to 6. By Dr. Elias Thorne's frantic estimation, The crime boss was currently trying to leave at least 3 of them on the cracked linoleum floor of the underground clinic. The makeshift operator suction, Elias snapped, his voice tight, muffled behind his surgical mask. Maya Lin didn't hesitate. Her movements were a blur of calculated efficiency, a stark contrast to the chaotic violence that had brought them to this moment. She thrust the Yankauer suction tip into the pooling cavity, the plastic tubing rattling violently as it slurped up the dark, viscous tide obscuring Elias. "I can't see the bleeder," Elias muttered, his fingers slick and clumsy as he probed the slippery terrain of Victor's viscera. The bullet, a high-velocity hollow point, had fragmented somewhere near the liver, tearing a ragged path through a network of critical vessels. "More gauze. Pack it down." Maya slapped a thick stack of laparotomy sponges into his palm. Elias shoved them into the wound, applying brutal, desperate pressure. For a moment, the relentless welling of crimson seemed to slow. Elias exhaled, a ragged breath that fogged his loops. Then the heart monitor began to scream. It wasn't the rhythmic, reassuring beep of life. It was a rapid, erratic staccato. Beep, 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 beep. The sound of a heart desperately trying to pump from an empty tank. "Vitals are crashing," Maya said, her dark eyes locking onto the glowing digits of the battered vital signs monitor. "Blood pressure is plummeting. 70/40. Heart rate is spiking to 140. He's in hypovolemic shock, Elias." "Squeeze the bags. Wide open," Elias barked. "The bags are dry," Maya replied, her voice eerily calm, though the sharp lines of her posture betrayed her tension. She pointed to the 4 poles. The 2 units of O-negative blood they kept in the clinic's hidden mini-fridge hung completely deflated, flat plastic husks entirely drained of their life-saving cargo. "Check the cooler. There has to be more." "There isn't. We used our reserve on the gunshot wound from Tuesday. You know this." The monitor's pitch shifted, growing higher, more desperate. 60/30. Victor's heavily tattooed chest heaved, a shallow, rattling gasp tearing through the endotracheal tube. Beneath the harsh glare of the halogens, the mobster's skin was turning the color of wet ash, the fierce, terrifying vitality of the anvil leaching away into the sterile drapes. Elias stared at the dying man. A dark, treacherous thought bloomed in the back of his mind. Let him die. If Victor's heart stopped right now, the city would be rid of a tyrant. A monster who orchestrated extortions, murders, and rampant misery across the 5 boroughs would simply cease to exist, reduced to a slab of cold meat on a stainless steel table. The world would be objectively better. Elias could step back, drop his hands, and let nature take its overdue course. But a sudden, thunderous pounding on the steel-reinforced door of the clinic shattered the fantasy. "Doc!" a voice roared from the other side. It was Dante, Victor's chief enforcer, a man whose baseline temperament was homicidal rage. "What's that alarm? If he dies in there, I'm burning this place to the ground with you 2 inside." Elias's eyes snapped up to Maya. She was looking at him, the unspoken reality passing between them. If Victor died on this table, Elias wouldn't live to see the dawn. Neither would Maya. Dante's men would butcher them both without a second thought, painting the walls of the clinic with their brains. "He's going into pulseless electrical activity," Maya warned, her fingers flying over the monitor's keypad, silencing the primary alarm, leaving only a dull, pulsing warning chime. "He has maybe 3 minutes before irreversible brain death. We need volume, Elias. Saline won't carry oxygen. We need blood." "I don't have any," Elias yelled, the desperation finally bleeding through his clinical detachment. "I can't manifest it out of thin air." The heavy clinic door swung open with a violent metallic screech. Dante stood in the threshold, an absolute silhouette of violence, a suppressed submachine gun hanging from a tactical sling across his chest. His eyes darted from the pale, dying form of his boss to the blood-soaked surgeon. "You're losing him?" Dante snarled, stepping into the sterile field with muddy combat boots. "I need blood," Elias demanded, stepping between the enforcer and the operating table, asserting a sudden, reckless authority. "Oh, negative, or he dies in 2 minutes. Do you understand me? I am out of time and out of blood." Dante didn't blink. A slow, cruel realization dawned on his heavy features. He turned his head slightly, looking back out into the dim hallway of the clinic's waiting area. "Hey!" Dante barked to someone unseen. "Bring the stray in here." There was the sound of scuffling boots, a muffled grunt of pain, and the squeak of rubber soles being dragged across the floor. 2 of Dante's thugs hauled a man into the blinding light of the operating room. It was a young man, barely in his 20s, wearing the torn, blood-spattered leather jacket of the Marcano Syndicate Victor's sworn rivals. The boy's face was a swollen, purple ruin, his lips split and bleeding. His hands were zip-tied behind his back. He looked terrified, his wide, darting eyes taking in the blood-slicked surgical room, the dying boss on the table, and the masked surgeon holding the dripping suction tube. "We grabbed him during the ambush," Dante said, his voice flat, devoid of any human empathy. "Marcano's boys all wear dog tags now so they can patch each other up. Look at his neck." Maya moved before Elias could. She stepped up to the terrified boy, ignoring his flinching, and hooked a gloved finger under the silver chain around his throat. She flipped the metal tag. "Oh, negative," Maya read aloud, her voice tight. She looked at Elias. The silence in the room suddenly felt heavier than the oppressive heat. "No," Elias whispered, taking a step back. "No, absolutely not. He's got blood," Dante said, stepping up to Elias, invading his personal space, smelling of gunpowder, stale sweat, and cheap cologne. "My boss needs it. Take it out of him and put it in the anvil." "I am a doctor," Elias said, his voice shaking. His hands raised in front of him as if to ward off the sheer insanity of the command. "I cannot forcefully drain a human being to save another. That is an execution. It violates every oath I have ever taken." Dante unholstered a heavy, matte black pistol from his hip and pressed the suppressor directly against Maya's temple. Maya gasped, her eyes widening, but she stood rigidly still. "Your oath is to keep my boss breathing," Dante whispered, cocking the hammer of the pistol. The mechanical click echoed like a gunshot in the sterile room. "You have 60 seconds to start the transfer document, or I paint your nurse across the monitors. And then I start shooting off your fingers one by one." The captive boy began to thrash, sobbing, dropping to his knees. "Please, oh God, please man, don't do this. I got a little girl. Please." Elias felt the room tilt, the edges of his vision blurred with static. Primum non nocere. First, do no harm. It was the bedrock of his soul, the foundation of the life he had built before his disgrace, before the underground clinic, before the midnight knocks. To carve into a man to save him was one thing. To act as a vampire, to siphon the life force from an unwilling, terrified boy to sustain a monster. It was the final crossing of a line from which he could never, ever return. "Elias," Maya said. Her voice was steady, despite the gun barrel digging into her skin. Her eyes bored into his, pleading, pragmatic, desperate. "Do it. Survive." The monitor emitted a long, continuous tone. Victor's heart had stopped. "Do it," Dante roared. Elias moved, The hesitation fractured and shattered under the sheer weight of survival instinct. He lunged toward the supply cart, ripping open a sterile rapid transfusion kit. He didn't look at the boy. If he looked at the boy's eyes, he would break. "Hold his arm down," Elias barked at the thugs. The two massive men slammed the Marcano boy into a rolling stool, pinning his left arm flat onto a mayo stand. The boy screamed, thrashing wildly, pleading for his mother, his daughter, his life. Elias snatched a massive 14-gauge needle, a hollow piece of steel as thick as a cocktail straw. He swabbed the boy's antecubital fossa with a frantic swipe of iodine. He didn't wait for it to dry. He didn't feel for the vein. He could see it bulging against the pale, terrified flesh. With a swift, brutal motion, Elias plunged the needle in. The boy shrieked, a raw, ragged sound that tore at Elias's conscience like jagged glass. A flash of dark, ruby red instantly filled the plastic chamber of the catheter. Elias advanced it, taped it down with a single strip of silk tape, and attached the heavy plastic tubing. "Pump!" Elias commanded Maya. Dante lowered the gun, allowing Maya to step forward. She connected the other end of the line directly to a central venous catheter already resting in Victor's jugular. She fed the tubing through the mechanical rapid infuser, a specialized peristaltic pump designed to force fluids into a body at massive speeds. She hit the power switch. The machine hummed to life, a low, mechanical grinding sound. Elias watched in horrific fascination as the thick, dark blood raced through the clear plastic tubing. It leaped from the arm of the weeping, bound captive, whirled through the gears of the infuser, and shot directly into the neck of the dying warlord. It was a grotesque umbilical cord, bridging two warring factions, transferring the essence of life by brute force. "Epinephrine," Elias ordered, his voice cold, detached, entirely hollowed out. 1 milligram. Push it now. Maya injected the stimulant into the line. 10 seconds passed. The only sounds were the sobbing of the Marcano. 15 seconds. The boy began to pale, his struggles weakening as the machine aggressively siphoned his blood volume. His lips were taking on a faint blue tinge. 20 seconds. The monitor hitched. The continuous tone broke. Beep. A pause. Beep. Beep. "We have a rhythm," Maya whispered, staring at the screen. "Sinus tachycardia. Blood pressure is climbing. 85/50. Beneath Elias's bloody hands, Victor's chest heaved with a sudden, violent gasp. The sickly ash color of his skin began to recede, replaced by a flush of stolen vitality. The bleeder in the abdominal cavity, which had stopped flowing when the heart stopped, began to well up again, but this time Elias was ready. "I see the bleeder," Elias said, his voice utterly devoid of emotion. "Hand me the DeBakey forceps and a silk tie." He worked with mechanical precision, isolating the torn hepatic vessel, tying it off with a knot so tight it cut into his own gloved fingers. The bleeding stopped. The field was secure. Beside him, the Marcano boy's head lolled forward. His eyes were half closed, rolling back into his skull. He was shivering violently, the onset of severe hypovolemic shock ravaging his nervous system. "Turn off the pump," Elias said. Maya hit the switch. The hum died. "Keep it going," Dante ordered, his eyes locked on Victor. "Drain the rat dry. Make sure the anvil is full." "No," Elias said. He didn't shout. He didn't plead. He simply turned his head and looked at Dante. The surgeon's eyes above his mask were dead, cold, reflecting the absolute abyss he had just thrown himself into. "He has enough to stabilize. If you drain this boy, his heart stops, the blood coagulates, and the line clogs. He's done." Dante stared at Elias for a long moment, sizing up the broken doctor. Then, the enforcer snorted, holstering his weapon. Fine. Throw the trash in the holding cell. He barked at his men. They yanked the needle from the boy's arm, not bothering to apply pressure. A stream of blood hit the floor before they dragged his limp, shivering body out of the room, leaving a smeared trail of red across the linoleum. Elias stood over the operating table. Victor Calloway was breathing steadily. The monitors blinked with reassuring, rhythmic green numbers. The tyrant was saved. "We need to close the fascia," Maya said softly, holding up a curved suture needle clamped in a needle driver. Elias took the instrument. His hands were no longer shaking. They were perfectly, terrifyingly still. As he drove the steel needle through Victor's flesh, pulling the heavy thread to stitch the monster back together, Elias realized the chilling truth. He had saved the patient, but the doctor had died on the table. He was no longer a healer. He was the devil's scalpel, and he had just drawn his first drop of innocent blood. The human brain does not simply sit dormant within the skull. It breathes. Beneath the glaring, shadowless halos of the surgical theater's overhead lights, Dr. Elias Thorne watched the pearlescent gray topography of Victor, the Anvil Calloway's exposed cerebral cortex expand and contract in perfect, fragile synchrony with the hiss of the mechanical ventilator. It was a terrifyingly intimate thing to witness. Here lay the apex of human evolution, the biological engine of a man who ruled the city's underworld with iron and blood, rendered as vulnerable as a shelled oyster on a bed of sterile blue drapes. Elias did not see the mob boss. He saw only the anatomy, the puzzle, the wound. "Suction?" Elias murmured, his voice muffled by his surgical. Beside him, Maya Lin moved with fluid, anticipatory grace. The slender glass tip of the Fraser suction tube dipped into the cranial cavity, slurping away a sudden, pooling crimson tide before it could obscure the surgical field. For the past 3 hours, they had waged a desperate millimeter-by-millimeter war against the Reaper. They had navigated the catastrophic swelling, managed the ruptured middle meningeal artery that had threatened to drown Calloway's mind in its own blood, and meticulously cleared the splintered fragments of his shattered parietal bone. Now came the delicate, unforgiving work of closing the vault. Reconstruction. "Synthetic dura," Elias commanded, extending a gloved hand without breaking his gaze from the microscopic landscape before him. Before the graft could touch his palm, a heavy, concussive thud reverberated through the reinforced concrete ceiling above them. The impact was violent enough to rattle the stainless steel instruments resting on the Mayo stand. The high-pitched ping of a dropped scalpel echoing against the ceramic floor tiles was immediately swallowed by a second sound, the unmistakable rapid-fire stutter of a suppressed submachine gun. Elias's hands, suspended over the open chasm of Calloway's skull, did not so much as twitch. He had trained his central nervous system to sever its connection to the instinct of panic. But Maya's head snapped upward, her dark eyes narrowing above her surgical mask. "The perimeter sensors," she said, her voice dropping an octave, abandoning the cadence of a scrubbed nurse and adopting the clipped, icy tone of a tactician. On the wall monitor adjacent to Victor's vitals, a schematic of the clinic's ground floor flashed an angry, pulsing red. "Front door is breached. 3 no for heat signatures. Moving fast. They aren't local beat cops, Elias. Cops announce themselves. This is a hit squad." "The Dura, Maya," Elias repeated, his tone flatter, harder. "Elias, if they get down the stairwell. If I don't close this dural tear in the next 3 minutes, cerebrospinal fluid will leak into the epidural space, and Victor Calloway will die of a catastrophic infection before those men ever chamber around. The graft. Now." Maya hesitated. Elias did not watch her leave. He heard the rustle of sterile paper being discarded, the heavy, metallic clack of the weapons locker being thrown open, and the cold, mechanical rack of a slide chambering a 9mm hollow point round. The heavy steel vault door of the underground operating room hissed open, letting in the damp, copper-scented draft of the basement stairwell, and then slammed shut with a definitive, ringing finality. Elias was alone with the monster on the table. He lowered his surgical loops over his eyes, plunging his vision into the magnified, microscopic world of the incision. He needed to suture the synthetic graft to the ragged edges of Victor's native dura mater. He took the needle holder, pinching a curved needle finer than an eyelash, threaded with proline suture as thin as a ghost's breath. Breathe in, pierce the tissue. Breathe out, pull the thread. Above him, the ceiling shuddered again. Dust, fine as powdered snow, drifted from the recessed lighting fixtures. Elias shifted his body to shield the open wound from the falling particulate, his elbows locked against his ribs to stabilize his forearms. Breathe in, loop the knot. Breathe out, slide it down. He fell into the rhythm of the work, forcing the violent vibrations of the world above to become nothing more than a metronome for his sutures. He could smell the sharp, metallic tang of the blood mixing with the ozone scent of the bipolar electrocautery. The rhythmic beep of the electrocardiogram was his only companion. Beyond the heavy steel door, Maya Lin stepped into the shadows of the concrete stairwell. The air out here was freezing, smelling of old rain, rat poison, and the distinct, acrid bite of freshly burned cordite drifting down from the clinic above. She checked the seating of the magazine in her customized Sig Sauer P226. 15 rounds. She had 2 spare magazines in the tactical rig she had strapped over her blood-spattered scrubs. She moved silently up the first flight of stairs, her rubber-soled surgical clogs making absolutely no sound on the grit-covered concrete. The stairwell was a fatal funnel, a narrow vertical shaft illuminated only by the sickly, flickering yellow glow of a single caged emergency bulb on the landing. It was the perfect defensive position. Heavy, booted footsteps pounded against the floorboards directly above her. Voices speaking in rapid. The door at the top of the stairwell was kicked open with enough force to shatter the wooden frame. A beam of harsh white light from an underbarrel flashlight sliced through the gloom, illuminating the swirling dust in the air. Maya pressed her back against the cold cinderblock wall just beneath the landing. She slowed her breathing, letting the adrenaline wash through her veins, sharpening her senses. She could hear the creak of leather, the heavy, labored breathing of the point man as he peered down into the darkness. "Clear the hole," a gruff voice commanded from above. The point man took his first step down. Maya pivoted around the corner, leading with the tritium night sights of her pistol. She didn't aim for the head. It was too small a target in the dark. She aimed for the center mass of the dark silhouette descending the stairs. She squeezed the trigger twice. Crack, crack. In the confined space of the stairwell, the unsuppressed gunfire was deafening, a physical force that punched against her eardrums. The muzzle flashes painted the concrete walls in strobes of violent, momentary daylight. The point man grunted, a wet, heavy sound, and pitched forward, tumbling down the remaining stairs in a tangle of limbs and tactical gear to land in a crumpled heap at the bottom. "Contact!" someone screamed from above. A hail of return fire tore into the stairwell. Maya dropped into a crouch, curling herself against the landing wall as chips of concrete and sparks rained down upon her. Bullets chewed through the cinder blocks, filling the air with a blinding, choking cloud of pulp. Back in the pristine white silence of the operating room, Elias felt the shockwaves of the gunfire vibrating up through the soles of his shoes. The monitor tracking Victor's heart rate spiked, a jagged mountain range of neon green lines. "Stay with me, Victor," Elias whispered, his voice a harsh rasp in the quiet room. "You don't get to die on my table. You don't get the easy way out." The dural graft was secure. Now the final armor. Elias turned to the sterile tray and picked up the custom-molded titanium cranial mesh. It shone under the lights, a beautifully machined lattice of silver metal designed to replace the shattered bone. He carefully positioned the plate over the defect in Calloway's skull, ensuring the margins overlapped the healthy bone perfectly. He reached for the pneumatic surgical drill. "Maya," he muttered to the empty room. "Give me 2 minutes. Just 2. He pressed the drill bit to the bone. He engaged the pedal. The high-pitched, mechanical whine of the drill bit biting into the calcium of the skull filled the room, a screaming countermelody to the muffled roar of the gun battle outside. Elias drilled the first burr hole, the vibration traveling up his hand, deep into the bones of his forearm. Bone dust curled upward like tiny wisps of white smoke. He swapped the drill for a customized screwdriver, lifted a tiny, self-tapping titanium screw with a pair of forceps, and drove it into the bone, anchoring the first corner of the plate. 1. In the stairwell, Maya was running out of time and space. The Russians were laying down suppressing fire, chewing the landing to pieces, and preparing to toss a fragmentation grenade down the shaft. She could hear the distinct metallic clink of a pin being pulled. "No, you don't," she thought. Relying entirely on muscle memory and spatial awareness, Maya threw herself out from behind her cover. "Grenada!" a terrified voice shrieked. The explosion was apocalyptic. The shockwave blew the heavy steel door at the top of the stairs clean off its hinges, sending it crashing down the shaft. A fireball of orange and black consumed the upper landing, followed by a shower of burning debris and a thick, suffocating cloud of gray smoke. The concussive force slammed into Maya, driving the breath from her lungs and ringing her ears with a high-pitched, maddening tinnitus. She coughed, tasting blood and plaster dust, her vision swimming with dark spots. Inside the explosion knocked Elias off balance. His shoulder slammed hard into the surgical boom arm, the overhead lights swinging wildly, casting chaotic, shifting shadows across the sterile field. The power grid flickered, the lights dying for one terrifying second before the clinic's backup generators kicked in with a deep, vibrating hum. Elias caught his balance, his eyes snapping immediately back to the operative field. The titanium plate hadn't shifted. His hands hadn't slipped. He exhaled a long, shuddering breath. He picked up the drill again. 2, 3, 4. He drove the remaining screws into the skull, securing the titanium plate with absolute, unyielding permanence. He ran a gloved finger over the edge of the mesh, feeling the smooth transition. "Irrigation," he said to himself, picking up a bulb syringe and flushing the surgical site with warm, sterile saline, washing away the bone dust and the lingering traces of blood. He moved on to the scalp, pulling the thick, heavy flaps of skin back over the titanium plate. He selected a heavy nylon suture, his hands moving in a rapid, complex ballet of tying and cutting. With every stitch, he closed the violent gash that had brought the underworld kingpin to his door. He pulled the skin taut, the black nylon thread biting into the flesh, sealing the man's mind back inside its dark, quiet shell. The final knot was tied. Elias cut the thread. He stepped back from the table, his chest heaving, sweat stinging his eyes beneath the surgical cap. He looked at the monitor. Victor Calloway's heart rate had settled into a steady, rhythmic, powerful march. The anvil would live. A heavy, metallic scrape drew Elias's attention. The reinforced vault door of the door groaned open. Maya stood in the threshold. She was a horrifying sight. Her sterile scrubs were plastered to her body with... She leaned heavily against the doorframe, her chest rising and falling in jagged gasps. She looked past Elias, her dark, exhausted eyes landing on the motionless, bandaged head of the mob boss on the table. "They're done," Maya rasped, her voice rough as sandpaper. She coughed, spitting a glob of bloody phlegm onto the pristine ceramic tiles. "The stairs are blocked with rubble. We have maybe 20 minutes before the smoke draws the fire department." Elias looked from the masterpiece of surgical precision on the table to the battered, bloody warrior in the doorway. He reached up, untying his surgical mask and letting it fall to his chest. He stripped off his bloodied latex gloves, the snap of the rubber echoing loudly in the suddenly quiet room. "The wound is closed," Elias said softly, moving toward her to inspect the gash on her face. "Now we get out of hell." The water running into the deep stainless steel basin was the exact shade of diluted Merlot. Dr. Elias Thorne stood over the sink, his forearms submerged beneath the scalding spray of the faucet, watching the blood of Victor the Anvil Calloway swirl down the tarnished brass drain. He scrubbed with a stiff bristled brush, digging the harsh bristles into the cuticles of his fingers, scraping away the microscopic remnants of the night's horrors. He scrubbed until his skin was raw, until the water finally ran crystal clear, but the phantom sensation of warmth, the sticky, metallic heat of another man's torn arteries, refused to wash away. Behind him, the makeshift operating theater was a battlefield rendered in surgical steel and halogen light. The rhythmic, synthetic beep, beep, beep of the electrocardiogram was the only steady thing left in the room. It was the sound of a miracle or perhaps a terrible mistake. "Vitals are holding." Maya's voice broke the heavy silence. It was low, raspy from hours of unspoken tension and stale coffee. Elias turned, wiping his hands on a rough paper towel. Maya Lin stood by the surgical table, her scrubs stained with dark, rust-colored constellations. She was methodically sorting the bloody instruments, hemostats, retractors, the bone saw, and the devil's scalpel itself, into the metal autoclave pan. Her face, framed by a messy bun of black hair, was an unreadable mask of pragmatism. She didn't look like a woman who had just spent 6 hours helping pull the city's most ruthless crime syndicate boss back from the jagged edge of hell. She looked like a mechanic finishing a double shift. "Blood pressure?" Elias asked, his voice cracking. He cleared his throat, the taste of copper and adrenaline still thick on his tongue. 110/72. "Heart rate is a steady 65, Maya replied, glancing at the monitor. "Temperature is 98.4. He's stabilizing. Against all medical logic, the bastard is actually stabilizing." Elias walked over to the operating table. Victor Calloway lay beneath the harsh glare of the overhead surgical lamps, a mountain of bruised and battered flesh. The man's chest rose and fell in slow, measured increments. A thick web of fresh, and it was a masterpiece of desperate anatomy. A jigsaw puzzle of ruptured organs, severed vessels, and lead fragments put back together by sheer will and blind panic. Looking at Victor now, stripped of his bespoke Italian suit and his terrifying aura of control, Elias could see the roadmap of the man's violent life. Pucker marks from old bullet wounds, jagged white lines of knife scars, the slightly sunken cavity of a previously collapsed lung. Victor was a walking monument to brutality, and Elias had just ensured the monument remained standing. "We need to start the broad-spectrum 4 antibiotics," Elias muttered, checking the line taped to Victor's thick forearm. Suddenly, the steady rhythm of the ECG spiked. Beep, beep, beep. Elias tensed, instinctively reaching for the crash cart. But Victor wasn't crashing. The heavy, bruised eyelids fluttered. A low, guttural groan, resembling the sound of a shifting tectonic plate, rumbled from deep within Victor's barrel chest. The anesthesia was burning off faster than Elias had anticipated. a testament to Victor's terrifyingly accelerated metabolism and sheer, stubborn refusal to stay under. "Victor," Elias said, his voice firm, slipping into his bedside manner like armor. "Don't move. You've been through massive trauma." The anvil's eyes snapped open. They were the color of wet slate, cold and intensely focused, completely devoid of the usual disorientation that accompanied waking from deep sedation. For a terrifying second, Victor didn't breathe. He simply stared at the water-stained sea. "You're in my clinic," Elias said, stepping into Victor's line of sight. "It's a close second. You took 2 rounds to the abdomen. One shredded your spleen, the other clipped your hepatic artery. You bled out on my table twice. But you're alive." Victor blinked slowly, absorbing the clinical details. He shifted slightly, testing the boundaries of his agony. A sharp hiss escaped his teeth as the fresh sutures pulled tight against his skin. "Don't test the stitches," Elias warned, his tone sharp. "I spent 3 hours closing that wound. If you tear it, you'll bleed to death before I can get the gloves back on." "I don't tear easily," Victor breathed, though he stopped moving. He looked past Elias, his slate eyes finding Maya. "The girl. She didn't run." "Maya is my head nurse," Elias said defensively. "She saved your life just as much as I did." Victor's lips curled into the faintest, bloodless ghost of a smile. "Loyalty. Hard to find. Harder to keep." He shifted his gaze back to Elias, the intensity in his eyes pinning the surgeon in place. "You didn't ask questions, document. You didn't hesitate. My men brought me in dying, and you played God." "I did my job," Elias said, though the words tasted like ash. "You needed a surgeon. I'm a surgeon." "You're more than that now," Victor whispered. The absolute certainty in his voice sent a chill down Elias's spine, a creeping frost that settled deep in his marrow. Victor raised a heavy, trembling hand, pointing a thick finger toward the corner of the room. Elias followed the gesture. Sitting on a rusted metal folding chair, practically blending into the shadows, was a black Halliburton aluminum briefcase. It had been brought in by Victor's men, the silent, blood-soaked wraiths who had dumped their boss on the table and vanished to stand guard outside the steel-reinforced door of the clinic. "Open it," Victor commanded. It wasn't a request. Elias hesitated. He looked at Maya, who gave a nearly imperceptible nod. She walked over to the chair, her rubber-soled shoes squeaking softly on the concrete floor. She laid the heavy case flat on a stainless steel prep table and snapped the dual latches. They echoed in the sterile room like gunshots. Maya lifted the lid. Elias felt the breath leave his lungs. Inside, packed with geometric precision, were stacks of perfectly banded $100 bills. The smell of the money, a distinct blend of crisp linen paper, stale ink, and the faint metallic tang of the street, wafted into the room, competing with the odors of bleach and dried blood. It was an obscene amount of wealth. $50, maybe $100,000. More money than Elias's underground clinic had made in 2 years of patching up desperate junkies, undocumented laborers, and low-level street thugs. The agreement was $20,000 for a gunshot extraction, Elias said, his voice sounding hollow, distant to his own ears. "The 20 is for the surgery," Victor said, his breathing shallow but steady. "The rest is a retainer." "A retainer?" Elias echoed, a sickening realization blooming in his chest. "I don't do retainers. This was a one-time emergency. I'm an independent contractor." Victor let out a dry, rattling chuckle that quickly devolved into a wince of pain. He waited until the agony passed before speaking again, his eyes locking onto Elias with the gravitational pull of a black hole. "You're a smart man, document, but you're lying to yourself," Victor said softly. Look around you. You operate in a basement. You buy stolen anesthetics. You scrape by. But tonight you showed me you have the hands of a maestro and the nerve of a killer. You didn't flinch when my blood painted your walls. I am a doctor, Elias insisted, though he stepped back from the table, suddenly wanting to put distance between himself and the man he had saved. You're an artist, Victor corrected, and artists need patrons. You think saving my life makes us even? No, it makes us bound. Every man out there who wants me dead now knows that I didn't die. They will wonder how. They will find out about the midnight surgeon with the devil's scalpel. You think you can go back to stitching up knife fights for pennies? Victor let his head loll back against the surgical pillow, exhaustion finally overtaking the adrenaline. Keep the money. Upgrade this shithole. Buy better equipment. Because I will be back. And my men will be back. You belong to the anvil now. Silence descended on the room, heavy and suffocating. The ECG monitor continued its indifferent, rhythmic chirping. Victor's eyes fluttered shut, the cocktail of painkillers and sheer physical trauma dragging him back into the dark velvet of unconsciousness. Elias stood frozen. He looked at the briefcase, at the stacks of green paper that promised salvation for his failing clinic, but guaranteed the damnation of his soul. He had spent the last 5 years trying to atone for the mistakes of his past, working in the shadows to help those who couldn't seek the light. But in saving the devil, he had unwittingly signed a pact. Maya stepped up beside him. She reached out, her fingers gently grazing the top stack of bills. It's enough to buy the new portable X-ray machine, she murmured, her voice pragmatic, stripped of moral judgment. Enough to pay off the Russian suppliers. Enough to keep the lights on for a very long time. It's blood money, Maya, Elias whispered. All money down here has blood on it, Elias, she replied softly, closing the lid of the briefcase with a definitive snap. Some of it is just fresher than the rest. Elias turned away from the table, feeling suddenly older, heavier. He walked past the sleeping titan on the operating table and made his way to the far end of the clinic. High up on the wall, near the ceiling, a row of narrow, grime-encrusted transom windows looked out onto the street level above. Elias reached up and cranked the rusted handle, pushing one of the small glass panes open. A blast of cold, damp morning air rushed into the stagnant clinic, carrying with it the sounds of the waking city. The distant wail of a police siren, the rumble of a garbage truck, the hiss of tires on wet asphalt. He looked up through the dirty glass. The oppressive, inky blackness of the night was finally bleeding away, giving way to a pale, bruised purple. It was dawn, but as the weak, gray light filtered down into the basement, illuminating the blood-stained grout of the floor and the gleaming steel of his surgical tools, Elias felt no warmth. The light didn't feel like a new beginning. It felt like an interrogation spotlight, exposing the grim reality of what he had become. He raised his hands, looking at his long, dexterous fingers in the cold morning light. They were perfectly clean. The blood was gone, washed down the drain. But as Elias stared at his palms, he knew the truth. The stain would never truly come out. He closed his eyes, listening to the steady heartbeat of the monster he had resurrected, and surrendered to the dawn of the damned.